Catherine Sterling stood in the center of her corral with blood on her hands and a fury in her chest that could burn down half the territory. 24 men had tried to break her stallion. 24 men had failed, and one of them wasn't getting back up. The black horse they called Tempest circled the fence line, nostrils flared, waiting for the next fool who thought dominance was the same thing as strength. Catherine knew better. She'd spent 3 years watching men destroy everything they touched, and she was done with all of it. Done with their arrogance, their violence, their absolute certainty that force could solve what patience never would. But somewhere out on the cattle lines, a man named Jake Morrison was hearing her story, and he was different. He'd lost enough to know that breaking something wasn't the same as winning it. If you want to know whether Catherine's impossible challenge destroys her ranch or saves it, stay with me until the end. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The man on the ground wasn't moving. Catherine Sterling stood at the corral fence with her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching Doc Henderson kneel in the dirt beside the crumpled form of Travis Kellerman. Travis had been bragging for 2 days straight about how he'd ridden broncs from Tucson to Santa Fe, how no horse alive could throw him, how that black devil in her corral just needed a firm hand and a sharp spur. Now he was unconscious with a possible fractured skull, and Catherine felt absolutely nothing. "You're going to get someone killed," Doc Henderson said without looking up. His hands moved carefully over Travis's ribs, checking for breaks. "Then maybe they should stop volunteering," Catherine replied. Around the corral, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. It was late afternoon, and the September sun painted everything gold and orange, but there was no warmth in it. Dry Creek Valley had turned out in force for Catherine Sterling's impossible challenge, and what they'd witnessed over the past 3 days had gone from entertainment to something darker. The town butcher had separated his shoulder. A drifter from Kansas had broken his wrist in 2 places. A professional horsebreaker from Denver had lasted 4 seconds before Tempest threw him into the fence so hard the railings cracked. And Catherine had watched every single failure with the same cold expression. "This ain't right," someone muttered from the crowd. "That horse is dangerous." "That horse is fine," Catherine said sharply. "It's the riders who are the problem." Tempest stood on the far side of the corral, his black coat gleaming like wet stone in the fading light. He was enormous, 17 hands of pure muscle and barely contained fury. His eyes were dark and intelligent, and right now they were fixed on Catherine with something that looked almost like understanding. She'd raised him from a colt, watched him grow wild and proud, and utterly unwilling to bend. When her husband died 2 years ago, people said she should sell Tempest before he killed someone. Catherine had told them all to go to hell. "Get him out of here," she said, nodding toward Travis. Doc Henderson and 2 other men carefully lifted the unconscious cowboy onto a makeshift stretcher. As they carried him past, Catherine caught fragments of their conversation. Dangerous woman, crazy horse, ought to be shut down. She didn't care. Let them talk. They'd been talking for 2 years, ever since Thomas died and left her a failing ranch, $3,000 in debt, and a town full of men who thought a widow needed their advice more than she needed air. "Miss Sterling," Catherine turned. Sheriff Wade Parker stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands and concern written across his weathered face. He was 50-something, decent enough, and one of the few men in Dry Creek Valley who still treated her like a person instead of a problem to be solved. "Wade," she acknowledged. "This has gone too far," he said quietly. "I know you're trying to prove something, but Travis could have died just now. You keep this up, and someone will." "The challenge stands," Catherine said. 50 gold coins to anyone who can ride Tempest for 10 minutes. Nobody's forcing them to try." "You're baiting them," Wade said. "Half these boys are doing it because they can't stand the idea of a woman making fools of them." "Then maybe they should examine their priorities." Wade studied her for a long moment. Thomas wouldn't have wanted this. The words hit harder than Catherine expected, but she kept her face neutral. "Thomas isn't here. I am. And this ranch doesn't survive another winter without that prize money coming back into my pocket instead of going out of it." It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. The Sterling Ranch was drowning in debt, and every failed rider had paid a $5 entry fee for the privilege of getting thrown. Catherine had collected over $100 so far, and not one person had come close to lasting 10 minutes. But the money wasn't really why she was doing this. She was doing it because she was tired. Tired of being told what she could and couldn't do. Tired of men showing up at her door with marriage proposals that were really just hostile takeovers. Tired of watching people assume that because her husband was dead, she was helpless. Thomas had been a good man, but he'd also been weak in ways that mattered. Too trusting, too soft, too willing to believe that handshake deals and good intentions would keep the ranch afloat. Catherine had spent their entire marriage cleaning up his mistakes, and now that he was gone, she was done apologizing for surviving. "I'm not shutting it down," she said. Wade sighed, settled his hat back on his head. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." He walked away and Catherine turned back to the corral. Tempest approached the fence slowly, his massive head lowered, his ears flicked forward. She reached out and touched his muzzle, felt the warm breath against her palm. "They think you're a monster," she murmured, "but you're just honest. That's more than I can say for most of them." Tempest nickered softly, a sound that was almost gentle. Catherine had spent 3 years learning his language. The shift of his weight, the angle of his ears, the way his eyes tracked movement. He wasn't vicious, he was proud, and he was tired of being treated like something that needed to be conquered. "One more day," she told him. "If nobody rides you tomorrow, we shut it down and figure something else out." She didn't believe anyone would succeed. 24 men had tried, and 24 men had failed. Why would the 25th be any different? But she was wrong. 300 miles north, Jake Morrison sat beside a dying campfire and listened to a story that made no sense. "They're saying she's a witch," Charlie Watts said, poking at the embers with a stick, "that the horse is cursed, that anyone who touches him gets the devil in their bones." "That's ridiculous," Jake said. "Yeah, well, ridiculous or not, 24 men have tried to ride that animal, and 24 men have failed. One of them's in a coma. Another lost 3 teeth and can't remember his own name." Charlie shook his head. 50 gold coins, though. Can you imagine? Jake could. 50 gold coins was more money than he'd seen in 5 years of pushing cattle across empty land for men who paid late and complained often. It was enough to buy a small plot of land somewhere, maybe start over, build something that didn't involve sleeping on frozen ground and eating beans out of a tin can. But Jake Morrison wasn't the kind of man who chased money or glory. He was 32 years old and looked older. His face was lean and hard, carved out by wind and sun and too many years of silence. He had dark hair that needed cutting, gray eyes that didn't give much away, and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a gift from a man who'd accused him of cheating at cards in a Tucson saloon. Jake hadn't been cheating, he'd just been winning. The distinction hadn't mattered. "You thinking about it?" Charlie asked. "No," Jake said. "Liar." Jake smiled faintly. Charlie Watts was 19, scrawny, and talked too much, but he was loyal in a way that mattered. They'd worked the same cattle outfit for the past 8 months, and Charlie had a habit of following Jake around like a lost pup. Jake didn't mind. It was easier than being alone. "I'm not a horsebreaker," Jake said, "and I'm definitely not stupid enough to chase a widow's dare." "It's not about being stupid," Charlie said. "It's about being smart enough to see an opportunity. Besides, you're good with animals. I've seen you gentle a spooked mare in half the time it takes anyone else." "That's different." "How?" Jake didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain it. He'd always had a sense for animals, a patience that came naturally, an instinct for reading what they needed instead of what he wanted from them. It wasn't magic, it was just attention. But attention required caring, and caring required vulnerability. And vulnerability was something Jake Morrison had stopped allowing himself a long time ago. "You should go," Charlie said. "Dry Creek Valley's only a 2-day ride. You got nothing keeping you here." That was true. Their cattle contract had ended yesterday, and Jake was already planning to drift south toward New Mexico, maybe find work on one of the big ranches outside Albuquerque. He had no ties, no obligations, no reason to care about some widow and her untamed horse. But something about the story stuck with him. Not the money, not the challenge, but the image of a woman standing alone in a corral, watching men destroy themselves trying to prove something she already knew they couldn't do. There was a kind of loneliness in that, a kind of exhaustion Jake recognized because he carried the same thing. "Maybe," he said finally. Charlie grinned. "I knew it. Don't get excited. I'm just thinking about it." But Jake was already packing. Catherine woke before dawn on the fourth day of the challenge and knew immediately that something was different. She couldn't explain how she knew. It was just a feeling, a shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. She dressed quickly, pulling on her worn work pants and a faded blue shirt, then walked out to the corral as the sky turned pale gray. Tempest was waiting for her, standing perfectly still in the center of the enclosure. His ears were pricked forward, his gaze fixed on the road leading into the ranch. Catherine followed his line of sight and saw a figure on horseback approaching slowly through the morning mist. Her first thought was that it was another arrogant fool coming to throw himself at Tempest and collect a story to tell in saloons. But as the rider came closer, she realized he was different. He was alone, for one thing. Most of the challengers had arrived with friends, with audiences, with witnesses to their inevitable glory. This man had no one. He rode a plain brown mare with no flash, no style, just steady competence. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes that had seen better days, and when he dismounted outside the corral, he moved with a kind of careful control that suggested either military training or hard-earned survival instincts. "Help you?" Catherine called out. The man turned, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. He wasn't handsome, not in the classical sense. His face was too hard for that, too marked by experience. But there was something in his eyes, something quiet and deep and unbearably sad, that caught her completely off guard. "Heard you have a challenge," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges. 50 gold coins for 10 minutes on that black horse." "That's right," Catherine said. "You here to try?" "Depends." "On what? On whether you're actually interested in someone riding him, or if you're just collecting entry fees and watching men get hurt." The bluntness of it startled her. Most challengers came in swaggering, full of bravado and empty confidence. This man just looked tired. "Both," Catherine said honestly. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough. What's your name?" "Jake Morrison." "You a professional horsebreaker, Jake Morrison?" "No." "Then what are you?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, there was no pride in it. "Nothing much, just a cowboy." Catherine studied him. She'd learned to read men over the years, learned to see through their performances, their posturing, their carefully constructed lies. But Jake Morrison wasn't performing. He was just standing there, waiting, with no expectation of success and no fear of failure. $5 entry fee, she said. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He counted out 5 silver dollars and handed them to her without ceremony. Catherine pocketed the money, then unlocked the corral gate. "You get thrown, you're done," she said. "No second chances." "Understood. And if Tempest hurts you badly enough, I'm not paying for the doctor." "Didn't expect you to." Catherine opened the gate. Jake stepped inside, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. Tempest, who had been calm moments before, went rigid. His nostrils flared. His ears pinned back. He pawed at the ground once, twice, a clear warning. Catherine had seen this reaction 24 times now, the horse recognizing a challenge, preparing for a fight. But Jake didn't move like a fighter. He stood just inside the gate, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady. He didn't approach Tempest, didn't try to corner him, didn't reach for a rope or a whip or any of the tools other riders had used. He just stood there, waiting. "What are you doing?" Catherine asked. "Letting him decide," Jake said. "Decide what?" "Whether I'm worth his time." It was the strangest thing Catherine had ever heard, and yet something about it made perfect sense. She watched as Jake took a single slow step forward, then stopped. Tempest snorted, shook his massive head, but didn't charge. Jake waited another 10 seconds, then took another step. The process was agonizingly slow. 5 minutes passed. 10. The sun climbed higher, and by the time Jake reached the center of the corral, a small crowd had gathered outside the fence. Ranch hands, curious townspeople, a few of the men who'd failed earlier and wanted to see this stranger get what was coming to him. But Catherine barely noticed them. She was too focused on what was happening inside the corral. Jake stood 3 feet from Tempest now, close enough to touch, but not touching. The horse's ears were still back, his muscles tense, but he hadn't moved, hadn't charged, hadn't tried to intimidate. He was watching Jake the same way Jake was watching him, cautious, curious, waiting. "Easy," Jake murmured. His voice was so low Catherine almost didn't hear it. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm just here." Tempest's ears flicked forward, just slightly. Jake extended his hand, palm up, fingers loose. He didn't reach toward the horse. He just offered, and then he waited. Catherine held her breath. Tempest took one slow step forward, then another. His muzzle lowered toward Jake's hand, nostrils flaring as he caught the man's scent. For a moment, everything hung suspended. The entire world balanced on the edge of whether this proud, untamed animal would choose trust or violence. Then Tempest's nose touched Jake's palm, and the tension shattered. The crowd gasped. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, something she didn't have a name for, because what she was watching wasn't dominance or submission. It was recognition. Jake moved his hand slowly, carefully, letting his fingers brush along Tempest's jaw, up toward his ears. The horse leaned into the touch, and for the first time in 3 years, Catherine saw Tempest relax. Truly relax. Not the wary calm of an animal biding its time, but the deep, bone-level ease of a creature who'd finally found someone who spoke his language. "I'll be damned," someone whispered. Jake turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Catherine's through the fence rails. "Can I try mounting him?" Catherine couldn't speak. She just nodded. Jake placed his hand on Tempest's withers, applied gentle pressure. The horse shifted but didn't pull away. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take forever, Jake gathered a handful of mane and eased himself onto Tempest's back. The horse tensed, his muscles bunched. Catherine saw the exact moment he considered bucking, considered throwing this strange man into the dirt like all the others. But Jake didn't grab on tight, didn't dig in his heels. He just sat there, balanced and calm, one hand resting on Tempest's neck. "It's your choice," Jake murmured. "I'm not going to force you." Tempest stood frozen for 5 full seconds. Then, as if making a decision that surprised even himself, he took one careful step forward, then another. Then he began to walk, not wild, not violent, but with a slow, deliberate grace that left the entire crowd speechless. Catherine's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She watched as Jake and Tempest moved together around the corral, and she realized with absolute certainty that she was witnessing something she'd thought impossible. 10 minutes passed. 15. Jake never forced, never demanded. He simply rode, and Tempest simply carried him, and the trust between them was so obvious it hurt to watch. When Jake finally dismounted, the crowd erupted in chaos. People were shouting, arguing, demanding explanations. But Catherine didn't hear any of it. She was too busy staring at the man standing in the center of her corral, his hand resting gently on Tempest's neck, looking like he'd just discovered something he didn't know he'd been searching for. She opened the gate and walked inside. Up close, Jake Morrison was even more worn down than she'd realized. His clothes threadbare, his face marked by exhaustion and old pain. But his eyes were clear, and when he looked at her, she saw no arrogance in them, just quiet honesty. "You did it," she said. "Tempest did it," Jake corrected. "I just didn't get in his way." Nobody else figured that out. Then nobody else was paying attention. Catherine felt something shift in her chest again. That same unnamed thing from earlier, sharper now, more insistent. She'd spent 2 years building walls around herself, convincing herself that independence meant isolation, that strength meant never needing anyone. But standing here in the morning sun with this stranger who'd just done the impossible, she felt those walls crack. "The prize is 50 gold coins," she said. "I'll get it from the house." "I don't want the money," Jake said. Catherine blinked. "What?" "Keep it. Use it for the ranch. You need it more than I do." "You don't even know me." "How do you know what I need?" Jake's gaze moved past her, taking in the sagging barn, the fence rails that needed repair, the fields that had gone fallow. When his eyes returned to hers, they held understanding that felt almost invasive. "I know what drowning looks like," he said simply. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she had everything under control, but the words stuck in her throat because she was drowning, and they both knew it. "What do you want then?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Tempest, and something in his expression softened in a way that made Catherine's chest ache. "I want to stay," he said. "Work the ranch. help with the horses. I don't need much, just a place to sleep and something to do. Why? Because I've been drifting for 5 years, and I'm tired of it. And because that horse deserves better than what he's been getting. It was the truth, raw and unpolished, and completely without calculation. Catherine had spent 2 years listening to men lie to her, manipulate her, try to charm their way into her life and her property. Jake Morrison wasn't doing any of that. He was just asking for a chance. She should say no. Should tell him to take his prize money and leave. Should protect herself the way she'd been protecting herself since Thomas died. But when she looked at Jake, she didn't see a threat. She saw someone as tired and lonely and quietly desperate as she was. There's a bunkhouse out back, she said. It's not much, but it's dry. You can stay there. Relief flickered across Jake's face, brief but real. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This ranch is barely holding together, and I'm not easy to work for. I didn't expect you to be. Catherine held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked out of the corral. As she headed toward the house to dismiss the crowd and deal with the inevitable questions, she heard Tempest nicker softly behind her. When she glanced back, she saw Jake still standing there, his hand on the horse's neck, looking more at peace than any man she'd seen in years. And Catherine realized, with a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to hope, that everything was about to change. By noon, the news had spread through Dry Creek Valley like wildfire. The stranger rode the demon horse. The widow's challenge is over. Catherine Sterling finally met her match. People talked about it in the general store, the saloon, the church. Some were impressed. Others were suspicious. A few were downright hostile, convinced that Jake Morrison had used some kind of trick or witchcraft or chemical sedative. Catherine ignored all of it. She had work to do. Jake spent the afternoon settling into the bunkhouse, a small, weathered structure that hadn't been used since Thomas died. It was dusty and bare, but Jake didn't complain. He swept it out, checked the roof for leaks, and laid out his few possessions with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light. Catherine watched from a distance, pretending to be busy with other tasks. She told herself she was just making sure he wasn't stealing anything, but the truth was more complicated. She was curious about this man who'd accomplished in 20 minutes what 24 others couldn't do in 3 days. Curious about the sadness in his eyes, the scars on his hands, the way he moved like someone who expected pain but had stopped flinching from it. Miss Sterling? Catherine turned. Her ranch foreman, Marcus Hayes, stood a few feet away with his arms crossed and suspicion written all over his face. Marcus was 40, built like a bull, and had been with the ranch since before Thomas died. He was loyal, competent, and deeply protective of Catherine in a way that sometimes crossed the line into possessive. What is it, Marcus? That man, Marcus said, nodding toward the bunkhouse. You sure about this? Sure about what? Letting a stranger stay here. You don't know anything about him. I know he rode Tempest. That's more than anyone else managed. Maybe he drugged the horse. He didn't. How do you know? Because she'd watched it happen. Because she'd seen the way Jake moved, the way he waited, the way he offered trust instead of demanding submission. But she couldn't explain that to Marcus because Marcus didn't understand trust. He understood control. I know, Catherine said firmly. And he's staying. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to leave. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm just trying to protect you. I don't need protecting. I need help running this ranch. And Jake Morrison looks like he knows what he's doing. He looks like trouble. Then it's a good thing I can handle trouble. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Catherine watched him go, feeling the familiar weight of frustration settle over her. She was tired of being managed, tired of men thinking they knew what was best for her, tired of fighting for the right to make her own mistakes. Everything all right? Catherine startled. Jake had emerged from the bunkhouse, his expression cautious. He'd clearly overheard at least part of the conversation. Fine, Catherine said. Marcus is just protective. Of you or of his position? The perceptiveness of the question caught her off guard. Both, probably. Jake nodded slowly. I'm not here to cause problems. If my being here makes things harder for you, I can leave. You just got here. Doesn't mean I can't leave. Catherine studied him. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no pride. Just a simple willingness to walk away if that's what she needed. It was so different from every other man she'd dealt with that she almost didn't know how to respond. I want you to stay, she said. Why? Because I think you're good for Tempest, and because I think you'll work hard without expecting anything in return. That's all. Catherine hesitated. There were other reasons. Reasons she couldn't quite name yet. Reasons that had to do with the way Jake looked at her like she was a person instead of a problem. The way he moved through the world without taking up more space than he needed. But she wasn't ready to admit those things out loud. That's all, she lied. Jake didn't push, he just nodded, accepting her words at face value, and something about that acceptance made Catherine's chest tighten. I'll start first thing tomorrow, Jake said. Whatever you need. There's a lot that needs doing. That's fine. I'm good at fixing things. He turned to head back to the bunkhouse, but Catherine stopped him. Jake? He looked back. Thank you, she said, for not taking the money, for staying, for... She trailed off, not sure how to finish. Jake's expression softened. You don't have to thank me. I should be thanking you. For what? For giving me a reason to stop drifting. He walked away before Catherine could respond, leaving her standing alone in the yard with the sun beating down and too many feelings crowding her chest. She told herself it didn't matter. Told herself that Jake Morrison was just another ranch hand, nothing special, nothing worth worrying about. But deep down, she knew she was lying, because something had shifted today, something fundamental and irreversible. And Catherine Sterling, who'd spent 2 years convinced she didn't need anyone, was starting to realize that maybe she'd been wrong. The question was whether she had the courage to admit it. Jake woke before sunrise out of habit, not necessity. The bunkhouse was cold, and his breath came out in visible clouds as he dressed in the dark. Outside, the ranch was still and silent except for the distant sound of cattle shifting in their pen. He laced his boots, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the pre-dawn gray feeling more grounded than he had in years. The first thing he did was check on Tempest. The black stallion was awake, standing alert in his stall with his ears pricked forward. When Jake approached, Tempest nickered softly, a sound of recognition that hit Jake harder than it should have. He'd spent 5 years avoiding attachment, convincing himself that caring about anything was just asking to get hurt. But standing here in the quiet morning with this proud animal who'd chosen to trust him, Jake felt something crack open in his chest. Morning, he murmured, reaching out to stroke Tempest's neck. The horse leaned into his touch, and Jake allowed himself a small smile. You ready to work today? Tempest snorted, shaking his massive head, and Jake took that as a yes. He spent the next hour mucking stalls and checking the other horses, 3 mares, 2 geldings, all of them showing signs of neglect. Not abuse, exactly, but the kind of weariness that came from a ranch stretched too thin and a woman trying to do everything herself. Jake made mental notes as he worked. The barn roof needed patching. The water troughs were cracked. Half the tack was dry-rotted and useless. It would take weeks to get everything back in working order, maybe months. Good, Jake thought. That meant he had a reason to stay. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he'd finished the morning feeding and was repairing a broken fence rail when Catherine emerged from the main house. She looked tired, her dark hair pulled back in a messy braid, her shirt untucked. But there was determination in the set of her shoulders. And when she saw Jake already working, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe? Or relief? You're up early? She called out. Force of habit, Jake replied, hammering another nail into place. Figured I'd get started. Catherine walked over, her boots crunching in the frost-covered grass. Up close, Jake could see the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She looked like someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. You didn't have to start this early, she said. Didn't have anything else to do. She studied him for a moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed, not judged exactly, but measured against some internal standard he couldn't see. Finally, she nodded. There's coffee in the kitchen if you want some, and breakfast, nothing fancy, just eggs and bread. Jake's stomach growled at the mention of food, but he hesitated. I don't want to intrude. You're working for me now. That means you eat with the rest of us. Catherine's tone left no room for argument. Come on. Jake set down his hammer and followed her toward the house. It was a 2-story structure that had probably been impressive once, but now looked worn and faded. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged on one side, and several windows had cracked spiderwebbing across the glass. Thomas Sterling's neglect hadn't just affected the barn. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. Marcus Hayes sat at the table with two other ranch hands Jake hadn't met yet, a young Mexican man with a scarred cheek and an older fellow who looked like he'd been punched in the face by life one too many times. All three men looked up when Jake entered, and the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "This is Jake Morrison," Catherine said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug and handing it to him. "He'll be working with the horses. Jake, this is Marcus. You met him yesterday. That's Diego and Frank." Diego nodded politely. Frank just stared. Marcus said nothing, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was furious. "Morning," Jake said, taking a seat at the far end of the table. "Morning," Diego replied. Frank grunted. Marcus continued eating his eggs like Jake didn't exist. The silence was suffocating. Catherine seemed oblivious to it, or maybe she was just used to it. She moved around the kitchen with efficient familiarity, cracking eggs into a hot skillet, slicing bread, pouring coffee. When she set a plate in front of Jake, their hands brushed briefly, and he felt a jolt of something he couldn't name. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't mention it." Jake ate quickly, aware of Marcus's hostile stare burning into the side of his head. He'd dealt with jealous foremen before, men who saw any newcomer as a threat to their authority. Usually the best strategy was to keep your head down, do your work, and wait for them to realize you weren't interested in their territory. But something about Marcus felt different, more personal. "So," Frank said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you really rode that devil horse?" "I rode Tempest, yes," Jake said. "How'd you do it? Everyone's got theories. Some folks are saying you drugged him." "I didn't." "Then how?" Jake set down his fork. "I listened to him instead of trying to dominate him, that's all." Frank snorted. "That's all. Makes it sound easy." It wasn't easy. It just wasn't complicated. "There a difference?" "Yeah," Jake said. "Easy means anyone can do it. Not complicated means most people just choose not to." Diego laughed softly at that, but Marcus's expression darkened. "You think you're smarter than everyone else?" "No," Jake said evenly. "I think I was paying attention when everyone else was too busy trying to prove something." "Watch your mouth," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Marcus," Catherine said sharply, "that's enough. He's insulting everyone who tried to ride that horse, including me. He's stating a fact. You went into that corral trying to break Tempest, and Tempest broke you instead. Jake did it differently, and it worked. Either accept that or don't, but I'm not having this fight in my kitchen." Marcus pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I got work to do." He stormed out, and Frank followed him after a moment. Diego stayed long enough to finish his coffee, then stood and nodded at Jake. "Don't take it personally," Diego said. "Marcus gets like that when he feels threatened." "I'm not trying to threaten anyone, Tan," Jake said. "Doesn't matter. You did something he couldn't do, and he hates you for it." Diego shrugged. "Give it time. He'll either get over it, or he won't." Diego left, and suddenly it was just Jake and Catherine alone in the kitchen. She was washing dishes with more force than necessary, her shoulders tight with tension. "I'm sorry about that," she said without turning around. "Not your fault. He works for me. That makes it my responsibility." Jake stood and carried his empty plate to the sink. "You want me to leave?" Catherine turned to look at him, and there was something fierce in her eyes. "No, I want Marcus to remember that I'm in charge here, not him, and I want you to ignore his posturing and do your job." "I can do that." "Good." She dried her hands on a towel, her expression softening slightly. "What's your plan for today?" "Fix what needs fixing. There's a lot." "Tell me about it," Catherine said dryly. "Pick your battles. We don't have the money to fix everything at once." "Then I'll start with what matters most. The barn roof's leaking. That's a priority. And the water troughs need replacing before winter hits hard." Catherine nodded slowly, and Jake saw something like gratitude flicker across her face. "All right, there's lumber in the shed behind the barn. Tools are in there too. If you need anything else, let me know." "Will do." He turned to leave, but Catherine stopped him with a question. "Jake, why are you really here?" He looked back at her, this woman with exhaustion carved into every line of her face, and he told her the truth. "Because I'm tired of running, and because this place feels like somewhere I could stop." Catherine held his gaze for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding maybe, or just the recognition that they were both carrying more weight than anyone else could see. "Then let's hope you're right," she said finally. Jake nodded and walked out into the cold morning air, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The rest of the day passed in hard, physical work that Jake welcomed. He patched the barn roof, replaced 3 fence rails, and started building new water troughs out of salvaged lumber. His hands ached, his shoulders burned, and by the time the sun started setting, he was covered in sawdust and sweat. But he felt good, useful, grounded in a way he hadn't felt since before the war. That night, after a silent dinner where Marcus pointedly ignored him and Diego made awkward small talk, Jake returned to the bunkhouse and collapsed onto his narrow cot. He was asleep within minutes, dreamless and still. The pattern repeated itself for 3 days. Wake before dawn, work until exhausted, fall into bed, and disappear. Jake fixed what he could, made lists of what he couldn't, and slowly started to understand the rhythms of the Sterling Ranch. Catherine ran the operation with fierce efficiency, handling the books, managing supplies, and dealing with creditors who circled like vultures. Marcus oversaw the cattle and the grazing lands, barking orders at Diego and Frank with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years. And Jake worked alone, quietly repairing the damage that time and neglect had inflicted on the property. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. But on the 4th day, Catherine appeared in the barn while he was grooming Tempest and shattered his comfortable isolation. "I need you to come into town with me," she said without preamble. Jake looked up from brushing Tempest's coat. "Why?" "Because I have to pick up supplies, and I can't lift 50-pound feed bags by myself." "What about Marcus?" "Marcus is out checking the north pasture, and I'm not waiting 3 hours for him to get back." Catherine crossed her arms. "Unless you have a problem with it." "No problem," Jake said. "Just didn't think you'd want me representing the ranch in public." "Why wouldn't I?" "Because half the town thinks I cheated somehow, and the other half thinks I'm going to steal everything you own and disappear in the night." Catherine's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Let them think whatever they want. I need help, and you're available. Get the wagon ready." 20 minutes later, they were rattling down the dirt road toward Dry Creek Valley with Tempest tied to the back of the wagon and the morning sun climbing higher. Catherine drove, her hands steady on the reins, while Jake sat beside her and watched the landscape roll past. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded with things neither of them seemed ready to say. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine said finally. "Sure." "Where were you before you came here?" Jake considered lying, but what was the point? "Everywhere." "Nowhere. I've been drifting since the war ended." "Which war?" "The one with Mexico. I was with the cavalry for 3 years." Catherine glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "That explains the scar." Jake's hand moved instinctively to the mark on his face. "Not from the war. Got that in a saloon in Tucson." "Fighting?" "Defending myself. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah, one's about pride, the other's about survival." Catherine fell quiet again, and Jake thought the conversation was over. But then she asked, "Do you regret it?" "The war, I mean." Jake thought about that for a long time. He thought about the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the friends he'd lost, and the enemies he'd killed. He thought about coming home to nothing, no family, no land, no purpose, and realizing that the world had moved on without him. "I regret that it happened," he said finally, "but I don't regret surviving it." "That's an honest answer." "You asked an honest question." Catherine smiled slightly at that, and Jake felt something warm settle in his chest. It scared him how easy it was to talk to her, how she asked real questions and waited for real answers instead of filling the silence with empty pleasantries. He'd forgotten what that felt like. They reached Dry Creek Valley just before noon. The town was small and dusty, built around a single main street lined with wooden storefronts. Jake could feel people staring as they rolled through, curious eyes tracking the widow and the stranger, already spinning stories. Catherine ignored them completely, guiding the wagon to a stop outside the general store. "Wait here," she said, hopping down. "I'll get the list filled." But Jake followed her inside anyway. The store was dim and cluttered, every available surface covered with goods. Behind the counter stood a portly man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes. When he saw Catherine, his expression soured. "Miss Sterling," he said coldly. "Mr. Brennan," Catherine replied with equal frost. "I need to place an order. You still owe me $40 from last month, and I'll pay you $30 today and the rest next week. I have the money." Brennan shook his head. "No more credit, cash up front or no deal." Catherine's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "I just said I have the money. Not enough. I want the full balance paid before I extend any more credit." "That wasn't our agreement. Agreements change when customers don't pay on time." Jake saw the exact moment Catherine's control started to slip. The way her hands clenched into fists, the way her breathing quickened. He stepped forward before she could say something she'd regret. "How much does she owe?" Jake asked. Brennan looked at him like he'd just crawled out from under a rock. "Who are you?" Someone asking a question. "How much?" $40. Why? You planning to pay it?" Jake reached into his coat and pulled out the worn leather pouch he'd been carrying since he rode into the Sterling ranch. Inside was every dollar he'd saved over the past 8 months, wages from the cattle drive, money he'd been planning to use to start over somewhere. He counted out 40 silver dollars and laid them on the counter. "There, debt's paid. Now fill her order." "Now fill." The store went silent. Catherine stared at Jake like he'd lost his mind, and Brennan looked between them with narrowed eyes. "This ain't your business," Brennan said. "I'm making it my business. Fill the order." Brennan grabbed the money with a grunt and started pulling items from the shelves. Catherine caught Jake's arm and pulled him aside, her voice low and furious. "What are you doing?" "Helping," Jake said. "I didn't ask for your help." "I know. That was your money. All of it, probably." "It's just money. Just—" Catherine stopped, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're insane." "Maybe. But now you can get what you need and Brennan can stop acting like you're some kind of criminal." Catherine stared at him, and Jake couldn't read the expression on her face. Anger, maybe, or confusion, or something else entirely. Before she could respond, Brennan dumped an armload of supplies on the counter. "That's everything on the list," he said. "You want it or not?" Catherine turned away from Jake without another word and started loading supplies into a canvas sack. Jake helped, and for the next 10 minutes they worked in tense silence while Brennan watched them like a hawk. When everything was loaded onto the wagon, Catherine climbed up without looking at Jake, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly. The ride back to the ranch was excruciating. Catherine didn't say a word, and Jake couldn't tell if she was angry or embarrassed, or just processing what had happened. He wanted to explain himself, wanted to tell her that he'd spent 5 years watching people suffer because they were too proud to ask for help. And he was done standing by and doing nothing, but the words stuck in his throat. They were halfway home when Catherine finally spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." "I know," Jake said. "I can handle my own debts." "I know." "Then why did you?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion, the frustration, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting alone for too long. And he realized that this wasn't about money, it was about pride, about control, about the fact that accepting help meant admitting she couldn't do everything herself. "Because you've been carrying this place on your back for 2 years, Jake said quietly. "And I thought maybe you could use someone to share the weight, even just once." Catherine's hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment Jake thought she was going to yell at him, but when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do that." "Do what?" "Share the weight. I've been on my own for so long, I've forgotten how to let anyone in." Jake understood that better than she knew. "Then maybe we can figure it out together." Catherine turned to look at him, and something in her expression cracked. Not broke, just cracked, like ice under pressure, revealing the vulnerable person underneath. "Why do you care?" "Because I think you're drowning," Jake said, "and because I know what that feels like." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Catherine's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, but she blinked them back before Jake could be sure. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "That money was supposed to be your fresh start. It still is, just not the one I was planning. You barely know me. I know enough. What if I fail? What if the ranch goes under anyway and you wasted everything for nothing?" Jake shrugged. "Then at least I tried. That's more than I've done in 5 years. Catherine laughed, a short, sharp sound that was almost a sob. You're either the kindest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. Probably both, Jake admitted. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, lighter, less heavy with unspoken things. When they reached the ranch, Marcus was waiting in the yard with his arms crossed and suspicion written all over his face. Where have you been? He demanded. Town, Catherine said, climbing down from the wagon. Getting supplies. You didn't tell me you were leaving. I don't have to tell you everything I do, Marcus. Help unload this wagon. Marcus's gaze shifted to Jake, and his expression darkened. He go with you? Yes, and before you say anything, it was my decision. People are talking, Catherine, saying things about you and him, bad things. Let them talk, Catherine said coldly. I've got work to do. She stalked toward the house without waiting for a response, leaving Jake and Marcus alone with the loaded wagon. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I don't know what game you're playing, Morrison, but I'm watching you. I'm not playing any game, Jake said. You show up out of nowhere, ride that horse like some kind of miracle worker, and now you're following her around like a lost dog. You think I'm stupid? I think you're protective, but Catherine doesn't need protecting from me. How about you let me decide that? Jake held Marcus's glare without flinching. How about you ask Catherine what she needs instead of deciding for her? Marcus's fists clenched, and for a second Jake thought they were going to fight right there in the yard. But Diego appeared from the barn, breaking the tension. Everything all right? Diego asked carefully. Fine, Marcus bit out. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with anger. Diego watched him go, then looked at Jake with something like sympathy. You've made an enemy. Wasn't trying to. Doesn't matter. Marcus loved Miss Catherine's husband like a brother, and when Thomas died, Marcus convinced himself it was his job to take care of her. Now you show up, and she's actually letting you help, and Marcus can't stand it. She doesn't belong to him, Jake said. Try telling him that. Diego clapped Jake on the shoulder. Come on, let's get this wagon unloaded before he comes back and makes it worse. They worked together in silence, and by the time the sun set, Jake was exhausted again. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work and small victories. As he headed back to the bunkhouse, he saw Catherine standing on the porch, watching him. Their eyes met across the darkening yard, and she raised one hand in a small wave. Jake waved back, feeling that warm thing in his chest expand just a little bit more. He was in trouble, and he knew it. Because caring about Catherine Sterling meant caring about the ranch, and caring about the ranch meant staying. And staying meant risking everything he'd spent 5 years avoiding: attachment, vulnerability, the possibility of loss. But as Jake lay down that night and closed his eyes, he realized he didn't care about the risk anymore. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Catherine discovered that 3 of her best breeding mares had gone missing during the night. Jake heard her shouting from the bunkhouse and was halfway across the yard before he'd fully woken up. He found her standing at the empty paddock with Marcus, Diego, and Frank, her face pale with fury and something close to panic. They didn't just wander off, Marcus was saying. Someone cut the fence, look. He pointed to a section of wire that had been cleanly severed, the ends sharp and deliberate. Jake crouched down to examine the ground and found fresh hoof prints leading west toward the creek bed. How long ago? He asked. Maybe 4 or 5 hours, Marcus said without looking at him. They could be 10 miles away by now. Catherine's hands were shaking. Those mares are worth $600. I can't afford to lose them. We'll find them, Jake said, standing. The tracks are clear, and whoever took them wasn't trying very hard to hide their trail. Or they wanted us to follow, Marcus said darkly. Either way, we need to move fast. Jake looked at Catherine. I can track them, but I'll need someone who knows the territory. I'll go with you, Diego offered. No. Marcus stepped forward, his expression hostile. I'm going. Diego, you and Frank stay here and make sure nothing else disappears. Jake could feel the challenge in Marcus's words, the unspoken accusation that this was somehow Jake's fault, that his presence had brought trouble to the ranch. But there wasn't time to argue about it. Fine, Jake said. Get your horse. 20 minutes later, they were riding west with the sun barely clearing the horizon. Jake led the way, following the trail with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years tracking deserters and cattle thieves across hostile territory. Marcus rode beside him in hostile silence, and the tension between them was thick enough to choke on. They followed the tracks for 3 miles before Marcus finally spoke. "You know this is your fault, right?" Jake didn't take his eyes off the trail. "How do you figure?" "You show up, make a big scene riding that horse, and suddenly Catherine's got a target on her back. Word spreads that she's got valuable stock, and now thieves are circling." "The ranch had valuable stock before I got here," Jake said evenly, "and Catherine's had plenty of enemies without my help." "She had things under control." "Did she? Because from where I'm standing, this place was falling apart before I showed up." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what she's been through." "Then tell me." "Why should I?" "Because maybe if we both understand what we're dealing with, we can actually help her instead of fighting each other." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. "Thomas Sterling was my best friend. We grew up together, worked together, built this ranch together. When he married Catherine, I thought it was the best thing that ever happened to him. She was smart, strong, didn't take any nonsense from anyone. But Thomas wasn't built for the hard decisions. He was too soft, too trusting. People took advantage of him, and Catherine spent their whole marriage cleaning up his mistakes." "And when he died?" Jake prompted. "When he died, she was left with a mountain of debt and a bunch of creditors who thought a widow would be easy to squeeze. I tried to help, but she wouldn't let me, said she had to do it herself, had to prove she didn't need anyone." Marcus shook his head. "I watched her work herself half to death for 2 years, and she still wouldn't accept help. Then you show up, spend 1 day here, and suddenly she's letting you pay her debts and ride into town with her like it's the most natural thing in the world. And that bothers you," Jake said. "Of course it bothers me. I've been here the whole time, and she treats me like hired help. You're here 5 minutes, and she looks at you like—" Marcus stopped abruptly. "Like what?" "Like you matter," Marcus said roughly. "Like maybe she's not alone anymore." The admission hung between them, raw and painful. Jake understood it now. Marcus wasn't just protecting Catherine out of duty or loyalty. He was protecting her because he loved her, and Jake's presence was forcing him to confront the fact that his feelings weren't returned. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "Don't be sorry. Just don't hurt her." "I won't. You say that now. But I've seen men like you before, drifters who show up, make promises, then disappear when things get hard. Catherine doesn't need that. She needs someone who's going to stay." "I'm staying," Jake said. "For how long? Until the next town looks more interesting? Until you get bored or restless or decide you want something she can't give you?" Jake pulled his horse to a stop and turned to face Marcus directly. "I spent 5 years running from everything that mattered because I was afraid of getting hurt again. I'm done running. Whatever happens with Catherine, whatever happens with this ranch, I'm staying until she tells me to leave. And maybe not even then." Marcus stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "All right," Marcus said, "but if you break her heart, I'll break your neck. We clear?" "Crystal." They rode on, and the silence between them was different now. Not friendly exactly, but less hostile. They'd reached an understanding, even if it was an uncomfortable one. Jake was still the outsider, still the threat, but at least now Marcus knew where he stood. The tracks led them to a narrow canyon with steep rock walls on both sides. Jake dismounted and studied the ground carefully, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "They went in here," Marcus said, pointing to fresh droppings near the canyon entrance. "Yeah, but look at the tracks. They're scattered, confused. These horses were driven in here, not led." So it's a trap." The words were barely out of Jake's mouth when he heard the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. He spun around and saw 3 men emerge from behind the rocks, rough-looking types with hard eyes and hungry expressions. The one in the middle held a Winchester aimed directly at Jake's chest. "Well, well," the man said, grinning. "Look what we caught." Marcus went for his gun, but another of the men had him covered before he could draw. "I wouldn't," the second man said lazily. "Where are the horses?" Jake asked, keeping his voice calm. "Somewhere safe," the leader said, "along with a few other things we borrowed from the Sterling Ranch." "Borrowed," Jake repeated. "Yeah, that's an interesting word for theft. Call it what you want. Your lady friend owes some powerful people a lot of money, and we're here to collect." "Who sent you?" The man's grin widened, Someone who's tired of waiting for Catherine Sterling to pay up. Someone who thinks maybe she needs a reminder that debts don't just disappear because you ignore them. Jake felt cold fury settle in his gut. The bank. Smart man. Mr. Whitmore at First National is getting impatient. He figures if the ranch loses enough stock, Miss Sterling will have no choice but to sell to him at a discount. Then he gets the land he's been wanting, and she gets to walk away with whatever scraps he decides to throw her. That's extortion, Marcus growled. That's business. The leader gestured with his rifle. Now drop your guns and get on your knees, slowly. Jake calculated the odds. 3 armed men, 2 of them with clear shots. He could probably take one before they fired, but Marcus would die, and so would he. It was a losing proposition, no matter how he looked at it. He dropped his gun and knelt in the dirt. Marcus did the same, cursing under his breath. Smart, the leader said. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to ride back to that ranch and tell Miss Sterling that her horses will be returned when she comes to discuss terms with Mr. Whitmore. Alone. No law, no gunmen, just her. We clear? Go to hell, Marcus spat. The leader's expression hardened, and he swung the rifle toward Marcus. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. Wait, Jake said quickly. We'll deliver the message, just don't hurt him. See? Your friend here's got more sense than you do. The leader lowered his rifle slightly. You've got 3 days. After that, the horses get sold, and Miss Sterling loses a lot more than just livestock. Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you leave. Jake and Marcus retrieved their guns and mounted their horses, moving slowly and carefully. As they rode out of the canyon, Jake could feel the thief's eyes on his back, and it took every ounce of self-control not to turn around and start shooting. We should go back with more men, Marcus said once they were out of range. Ambush them tonight, take the horses back by force. They'll be expecting that, Jake said, and they'll kill the horses rather than let us take them. We need to be smarter. Then what do you suggest? Jake was quiet for a long moment, a plan forming in his mind. We give Whitmore what he wants, sort of. Explain. Catherine goes to see him, just like they demanded. But she doesn't go alone. She goes with leverage. What kind of leverage? The kind that makes Whitmore realize stealing from her is going to cost him more than he's willing to pay. Marcus looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. They rode back to the ranch in grim silence, and when they arrived, Catherine was waiting in the yard with Diego and Frank. Her face went from hope to dread when she saw their expressions. You didn't find them, she said flatly. We've found them, Jake said, dismounting. But there's a complication. He told her everything, the ambush, the thieves, the message from Whitmore. With every word, Catherine's expression grew colder, harder, until she looked like something carved from ice. That bastard, she said quietly. Thomas borrowed money from First National 3 years ago to expand the breeding program. We paid back most of it, but when Thomas died, Whitmore started adding fees and interest charges that weren't in the original contract. I've been fighting him in court for 18 months. And now he's decided to skip the legal process, Jake said. Apparently, Catherine's hands clenched into fists. I'll kill him. You'll do no such thing, Marcus said. We'll handle this. How? By giving him exactly what he wants? By letting him bully me into selling my ranch for pennies on the dollar? No, Jake said. By making him think he's won, then turning the tables. Catherine looked at him sharply. What are you talking about? You go see Whitmore like his men demanded, but before you do, we make sure everyone in Dry Creek Valley knows exactly what he's doing. We make it public, loud, and impossible for him to deny. Then when you walk into that bank, you're not walking in as a desperate widow. You're walking in as someone with the whole town watching. That won't stop him from sending his men after the horses, Marcus pointed out. No, but it'll make him think twice about killing them. Whitmore's a businessman. He cares about his reputation, his standing in the community. If word gets out that he's using criminal tactics to steal land from a widow, he's finished in this territory. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. It's risky. Everything's risky right now, Jake said. But at least this way we're fighting back instead of just reacting. And if it doesn't work, then we try something else. But doing nothing isn't an option. Catherine met his gaze, and Jake saw the exact moment she decided to trust him. All right, we do it your way, but I need you there with me. I'll be there, Jake promised. And me, Marcus added grudgingly. No. Catherine shook her head. I need you here protecting the ranch in case Whitmore sends more men. Diego and Frank, too. Jake and I will handle the bank. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Catherine's expression stopped him. Fine. But if anything happens to either of you, I'm burning that bank to the ground. Noted, Catherine said dryly. They spent the next 2 days quietly spreading the word. Diego mentioned it to his cousins in town. Frank told the story to anyone who'd listen at the saloon. Catherine made sure to visit the general store and the post office, casually mentioning that she had a meeting at the bank to discuss some irregularities in her loan. By the time Wednesday morning rolled around, half of Dry Creek Valley was talking about Catherine Sterling's troubles with First National Bank. Jake woke before dawn on Wednesday and found Catherine already dressed, pacing in the yard. She'd pulled her hair back severely and was wearing her best dress. A dark blue thing that was probably meant for church but made her look formidable instead of soft. You ready? Jake asked. No, but that's never stopped me before. They rode into town as the sun climbed higher, and Jake could feel the weight of eyes on them from every window, every doorway. Word had spread even faster than he'd hoped. By the time they tied their horses outside First National Bank, a small crowd had gathered across the street, pretending to go about their business, but clearly watching. The bank was a 2-story brick building that tried very hard to look important. Inside, it was all dark wood and brass fixtures, designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the door. Behind a massive desk sat Edmund Whitmore, a portly man in his 50s with slicked-back hair and cold eyes that assessed Catherine like she was livestock. Miss Sterling, he said without standing, right on time. Mr. Whitmore, Catherine's voice was ice. I believe you wanted to discuss my loan, among other things. Whitmore's gaze shifted to Jake. I don't believe I invited your hired help. Jake Morrison works for me, Catherine said. Anything you say to me, you can say in front of him. Whitmore's expression soured, but he gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Sit. They sat. Whitmore shuffled some papers, taking his time, clearly trying to establish dominance. Jake recognized the tactic. He'd seen it used by officers during the war, men who mistook cruelty for strength. Your loan with First National is in default, Whitmore said finally. You've missed 3 payments in the last 6 months. Because you tripled the interest rate without my consent, Catherine shot back. That wasn't part of the original agreement. The original agreement allowed for rate adjustments based on risk assessment. Your ranch's declining value constitutes increased risk. My ranch's value is fine, your manufacturing problems to justify theft. Whitmore's smile was cold. That's a serious accusation, Miss Sterling. Do you have proof? I have the original contract, and I have witnesses who will testify that you've been pressuring me to sell ever since my husband died. Witnesses can be mistaken. Contracts can be interpreted different ways. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to make you an offer. Sell me the ranch at a fair price, and I'll forgive the remaining debt. You walk away clean with enough money to start over somewhere else. What's your definition of fair? Jake asked. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. I don't recall asking for your opinion, Cowboy. Jake asked a valid question, Catherine said. What are you offering? $2,000? The number hung in the air like a slap. Jake saw Catherine's jaw tighten, saw the rage flash in her eyes. $2,000 for a ranch that was worth at least $20,000, even in its current state. That's insulting, Catherine said quietly. That's business. Take it or leave it. I'll leave it, and I'll take my horses back while I'm at it. Whitmore's smile widened. What horses? The 3 mares your men stole from my property 2 nights ago. I have no idea what you're talking about. Really? Because the men who took them mentioned you by name, said they were acting on your orders. Did they? Well, that's unfortunate. But I'm afraid you have no proof of these allegations. And without proof, you're just making wild accusations against a respected businessman. Jake had heard enough. He stood, placed both hands on Whitmore's desk, and leaned forward until they were almost nose to nose. Here's what's going to happen, Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. You're going to return those horses by sundown today. And you're going to stop harassing Miss Sterling about her loan, because as of this morning, it's paid in full. Whitmore blinked. Excuse me? Catherine turned to stare at Jake. What are you talking about? Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He'd spent the previous evening drafting it with Diego's help, making sure every word was legally sound. It was a promissory note transferring the remaining balance of Catherine's loan from First National Bank to Jacob Morrison, private creditor. The terms were simple. No interest, no pressure, payment when Catherine was able to make it. I bought out your loan, Jake said to Catherine. The bank no longer has any claim on your property. Catherine's face went white. Jake, that's over $3,000. Where did you... I had savings, some from the war, some from work. It was just sitting in a bank in Santa Fe doing nothing. Now it's doing something useful. But that's everything you have. Not everything. Jake looked at Whitmore. So what's it going to be? Are you going to return those horses and walk away? Or am I going to walk outside right now and tell that crowd exactly what you've been doing? Because I promise you, Mr. Whitmore, once I start talking, your reputation in this town is finished. Whitmore's face had gone from smug to furious. You're bluffing. Try me. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Whitmore reached for a bell on his desk and rang it sharply. A moment later, one of his clerks appeared in the doorway. Send word to the canyon, Whitmore said through clenched teeth. Return the Sterling horses. Sir, you heard me. Do it now. The clerk disappeared and Whitmore turned his glare back to Jake. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Jake said, because if you come near Miss Sterling or her property again, I'll make sure everyone from here to Santa Fe knows that Edmund Whitmore is a thief who hides behind legal paperwork. You understand me? Whitmore said nothing, but the rage in his eyes was answer enough. Jake offered his hand to Catherine. She took it, and they walked out of the bank together into the bright morning sunlight. The crowd across the street had grown larger, and as Jake and Catherine emerged, someone started clapping. Then someone else joined in, and within seconds, the applause spread through the gathered townspeople like wildfire. Catherine looked stunned. Jake just kept walking, guiding her toward their horses. They mounted up and rode out of town with the sound of applause following them, and it wasn't until they were halfway back to the ranch that Catherine finally spoke. Stop. Jake pulled his horse to a halt. Catherine did the same, then turned to face him with tears streaming down her cheeks. Why did you do that? She asked, her voice breaking. Because you needed help. You gave me everything, Jake. Everything you had. What if I can't pay you back? What if the ranch fails anyway? Then we figure something else out. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Jake dismounted and walked over to her, reaching up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, she didn't step back. She just stood there, looking up at him with tears on her face and something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Yes, you do. You don't even know me. Not really. I know enough. Jake reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. I know you're strong enough to run a ranch by yourself. I know you're proud enough to refuse help even when you're drowning. I know you loved your husband, but you're tired of living in his shadow. And I know that somewhere underneath all that armor you've built, there's a woman who's afraid to trust anyone because everyone she's ever trusted has either left her or let her down. Catherine's breath caught. That's not fair. No, it's not, but it's true. They stood there in the middle of the empty road with the sun beating down, and Jake could feel the moment stretching between them like a wire pulled tight. He knew he should step back, should give her space, should let her process everything that had just happened, but he couldn't move. Jake, Catherine said softly. Yeah? I'm scared. Of what? Of letting you in, of caring about you, of what happens when you realize I'm not worth all this trouble. Jake took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me. I've spent 5 years convinced I wasn't worth anything to anyone. I've been a ghost, Catherine, just drifting through life without purpose, without connection, without hope. And then I met you, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I could be something more than just another lost soul. You didn't save me, but you gave me a reason to save myself. So don't tell me you're not worth it. You're worth everything. Catherine made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she kissed him. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and desperate and full of 2 years of loneliness and fear and hope she hadn't let herself feel. Jake kissed her back just as fiercely, his hands tangling in her hair, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. When they finally pulled apart, Both of them were breathing hard. "That was probably a mistake," Catherine said. "Probably," Jake agreed. "We should talk about this. Figure out what it means. Later. Right now, I just want to get you home." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence, charged and electric and full of possibility. When they arrived, Marcus was waiting in the yard with Diego and Frank, and his expression shifted from concern to understanding the moment he saw their faces. "You got the horses back?" Marcus asked. "They'll be returned by sundown," Catherine said. "And the loan?" "Paid off." Marcus's eyes widened. "How?" "Jake bought it out." Marcus turned his stare to Jake, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then Marcus nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "That was a good thing you did," Marcus said quietly. "It was the right thing," Jake replied. Yeah, it was." Marcus cleared his throat. "I guess I was wrong about you, Morrison. You were protecting her. I can't fault you for that." Marcus held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Jake shook it. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a truce. And right now, that was enough. That evening, true to Whitmore's word, the 3 stolen mares were returned by a nervous young man who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Catherine checked them over carefully, confirmed they were unharmed, and sent the man away without a word. By the time the sun set, life on the Sterling Ranch had returned to something close to normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Not really. Jake lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over in his mind. He'd crossed a line today, multiple lines actually. He'd given up every dollar he had, confronted a dangerous man, and kissed his employer in the middle of the road like some kind of romantic fool. He should regret it, should be planning his exit strategy, figuring out how to extricate himself before things got more complicated. But he didn't regret any of it, not 1 second. Across the yard, Catherine sat at her kitchen table with a lantern burning low, staring at the promissory note Jake had given her. $3,200. It was more money than she'd seen in years, more than she'd thought anyone would ever trust her with. And Jake had given it to her without hesitation, without demands, without expecting anything in return except the chance to stay. She thought about Thomas, about the ways he'd loved her but never truly understood her. Thomas had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the harsh realities of running a ranch. Jake wanted to stand beside her while she fought those battles herself. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything she'd convinced herself she didn't need. Catherine folded the note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she blew out the lantern and went to bed. And for the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without the weight of debt crushing her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was still work to be done, fences to mend, livestock to manage, winters to survive. But tonight, for just a few hours, Catherine Sterling allowed herself to believe that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The awkwardness started the next morning at breakfast. Catherine walked into the kitchen to find Jake already there, pouring coffee with his back to her. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds before they both looked away like guilty teenagers. The memory of that kiss hung between them like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to discuss. "Morning," Jake said, his voice carefully neutral. "Morning," Catherine replied, accepting the coffee cup he handed her. Their fingers brushed, and she pulled back too quickly, sloshing hot liquid onto the floor. "Careful," Jake said, grabbing a rag. "I've got it." Catherine snatched the rag from his hand, then immediately felt stupid for the sharpness in her tone. "Sorry, I didn't sleep well." "Me neither." They cleaned up the spill in silence, both of them moving too carefully, too aware of each other's proximity. When Marcus, Diego, and Frank filed in a few minutes later, the relief was palpable. "What's for breakfast?" Frank asked, oblivious to the tension. "Whatever you make yourself," Catherine said, grateful for the distraction. "I've got paperwork to catch up on." She fled to her office before anyone could respond, leaving Jake standing in the kitchen with 3 pairs of curious eyes fixed on him. "What happened?" Diego asked. "Nothing," Jake said. Marcus studied him with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what had happened. "Right, nothing." The pattern continued for 3 days. Catherine threw herself into ranch work with renewed intensity, spending long hours in the barn or out checking fences, always managing to be somewhere Jake wasn't. Jake responded by working himself to exhaustion, rebuilding the entire North Pasture fence line, reorganizing the tack room, breaking his back on projects that could have waited weeks. They were both running, and everyone on the ranch knew it. On the fourth morning, Marcus had enough. He found Jake in the barn, grooming Tempest with more force than necessary, and didn't bother with pleasantries. "This is getting ridiculous," Marcus said. Jake didn't look up. "Don't know what you're talking about." "You and Catherine dancing around each other like a couple of fools. Whatever happened between you two, you need to deal with it before it tears this place apart." "There's nothing to deal with, liar." Marcus crossed his arms. "Look, I'm not good at this feelings nonsense, but I know what it looks like when two people care about each other and are too stubborn to admit it. You want her, she wants you, and you're both too scared to do anything about it." Jake stopped brushing and turned to face Marcus. "It's not that simple. It never is. But you made a choice when you bought out her loan, Morrison. You tied yourself to this ranch, to her. You don't get to back out now just because things got complicated. I'm not backing out. I'm trying to give her space. She doesn't need space. She needs you to be honest with her." Marcus's expression softened slightly. Thomas loved Catherine, but he never really saw her. He saw the woman he wanted her to be, not the woman she was. Don't make the same mistake. Before Jake could respond, Diego burst into the barn, his face flushed with urgency. "We've got a problem," Diego said, breathing hard. "Big problem." They followed him outside to find Catherine standing in the yard, staring at a piece of paper that had been nailed to the fence post. Jake read it over her shoulder and felt his blood go cold. The notice was from the Dry Creek Valley Cattlemen's Association, and it was brutal in its simplicity. Due to concerns about disease management and breeding standards, the Sterling Ranch was being excluded from the autumn cattle auction. No explanation, no appeals process, just a flat rejection that would cost Catherine thousands of dollars in lost sales. "This is Whitmore," Catherine said quietly. "He couldn't steal the ranch legally, so now he's going to strangle it economically." "Can he do that?" Jake asked. "The Cattlemen's Association is run by 6 ranchers, and Whitmore's brother-in-law is the president. They can do whatever they want." Catherine crumpled the notice in her fist. "Without access to the auction, I can't sell my cattle at fair market prices. I'll have to deal with individual buyers who will lowball me because they know I'm desperate." Marcus swore viciously. "There has to be something we can do. Appeal to the territorial governor, maybe, or—" "The governor doesn't care about ranch disputes," Catherine interrupted. "And by the time any legal process worked its way through the system, I'd be bankrupt." She took a deep breath, visibly forcing herself to calm down. "We need a different approach." "Like what?" Frank asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but grim. "We bypass the auction entirely, take the cattle directly to market in Santa Fe." The words landed like stones. Santa Fe was 200 miles south, and the drive would take at least 3 weeks through some of the most brutal terrain in the territory. It was dangerous, expensive, and exhausting, the kind of thing only desperate ranchers attempted. "That's insane," Marcus said flatly. "We don't have enough men, we don't have enough supplies, and we sure as hell don't have enough time before winter hits." "Then we hire more men and move fast," Catherine said. "With what money?" "I'll figure it out." "Catherine, I said I'll figure it out." Her voice cracked on the last word, and everyone fell silent. Catherine closed her eyes, composing herself. When she spoke again, her tone was calmer. "This ranch is all I have left. I'm not letting Whitmore or anyone else take it from me without a fight. So either help me plan this drive or get out of my way." Jake stepped forward. "I'll go with you." Catherine looked at him, and for the first time in 4 days, they held eye contact for longer than a heartbeat. "Jake, you don't have to—" "I'm going," he said firmly. "You need experienced riders, and I've done drives before. I know what to watch for." "So have I," Marcus added reluctantly. "I think this is a terrible idea, but I'm not letting you do it without me." Diego raised his hand. "Count me in." Frank nodded. "Me too." Catherine's eyes were suspiciously bright. "That's still not enough. A drive this size needs at least 8 men, maybe 10. "Then we hire them," Jake said. "There are always drifters looking for work this time of year. We post notices in town, offer fair wages, and see who shows up." "I don't have money for fair wages." "You will." Jake caught her gaze and held it. "The cattle sell in Santa Fe, you'll have more than enough to cover costs. Until then, we work on credit and promises. It's not ideal, but it's what we've got. Catherine studied him, and Jake could see her weighing the risks, calculating the odds, trying to find another option that didn't exist. Finally, she nodded. All right, we do it. Marcus, you and Frank start sorting the herd. Separate out the strongest animals. Anything that won't make the journey stays here. Diego, inventory our supplies and figure out what we need. Jake, she hesitated. Can you come with me to town? We need to post those hiring notices, and I could use someone who knows what kind of men we're looking for. Of course, Jake said. An hour later, they were riding toward Dry Creek Valley in tense silence. The awkwardness was back, thick and suffocating, and Jake couldn't stand it anymore. We need to talk, he said. About what? About what happened. About the kiss. Catherine's hands tightened on the reins. That was a mistake. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. Was it? Yes. I was emotional, overwhelmed, not thinking clearly. It shouldn't have happened. But it did happen. And now we move past it. Catherine wouldn't look at him. You work for me, Jake. Getting involved would be complicated and messy and probably disastrous for both of us. So you do want to get involved. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. Jake pulled his horse to a stop, forcing Catherine to do the same. Look at me. She didn't. Catherine, look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned. Her eyes were guarded, defensive, but underneath the armor, Jake could see fear. Not fear of him, fear of what he represented, the possibility of happiness, the risk of loss. I'm not Thomas, Jake said quietly. I'm not going to make promises I can't keep, and I'm not going to pretend this is simple when it's not. But I care about you, and I think you care about me, and pretending otherwise isn't going to make those feelings go away. What do you want from me? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Honesty. That's all. Just tell me the truth. The truth is, I'm terrified. The admission seemed to cost her something. I'm terrified of trusting you, of letting myself hope that maybe this could work. Because everyone I've ever trusted has either left or died, and I can't go through that again. I'm not going anywhere. You can't promise that. Nobody can. You're right, Jake said. I can't promise I won't die tomorrow. I can't promise that something won't happen that tears us apart, but I can promise that I won't leave voluntarily. I can promise that whatever happens, I'll fight to stay. Is that enough? Catherine's eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill over. I don't know. Then figure it out. But while you're figuring it out, stop running from me. Stop treating me like a stranger you have to keep at arm's length. I'm here, Catherine. I'm right here. And I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to. For a long moment, Catherine said nothing. Then she wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand and urged her horse forward. Jake followed, and they rode the rest of the way to town in silence. But something had shifted between them, not resolved exactly, but acknowledged. The elephant in the room had been named, and there was no going back. They posted hiring notices at the saloon, the general store, and the boarding house, then stopped by the livery to arrange for additional pack animals. It was routine work, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He caught glimpses of faces in windows, heard whispers that stopped when they approached. By the time they left town, his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Did you notice? Catherine asked as they cleared the town limits. Yeah, word's spreading fast. Too fast. Someone's talking. Whitmore, Jake said grimly. He wants people to know we're desperate. The more public this gets, the harder it'll be to find honest help. Then we move faster than he expects. They rode hard back to the ranch. And over the next 3 days, the Sterling Ranch transformed into organized chaos. Marcus and Frank sorted 500 head of cattle, selecting the strongest and healthiest for the drive. Diego took inventory and made supply runs, stretching their limited budget as far as it would go. And Catherine coordinated everything with the focused intensity of a general preparing for war. Jake threw himself into the preparations, but he couldn't stop watching Catherine. She was magnificent in her element, sharp, decisive, tireless. But he also saw the cracks, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking, the exhaustion that settled over her features when she finally stopped moving long enough to breathe. She was running on fumes and sheer willpower, and Jake knew it couldn't last. On the fifth day, 4 men showed up at the ranch looking for work. They were a rough bunch, 2 former soldiers, a Mexican vaquero, and a kid who couldn't have been more than 17. Jake interviewed them carefully, watching for signs of dishonesty or incompetence. 3 of them passed muster. The fourth, a scarred man named Cooper who claimed cavalry experience, set off every alarm bell in Jake's head. "I don't trust him," Jake told Catherine after the interviews. "We need the bodies," Catherine said. "We're still 2 men short." "Better short than betrayed. That man's hiding something." "Everyone's hiding something." Catherine's tone was sharp with exhaustion. "Just keep an eye on him during the drive. If he causes problems, we deal with it then." Jake wanted to argue, but he could see Catherine was at her breaking point. So he let it go, filed Cooper away as a potential problem, and focused on the work. 2 more men arrived over the next week, both experienced drovers with solid references. With Marcus, Diego, Frank, Jake, and the 6 hired hands, they had enough crew to manage the herd. Barely. The night before they were set to leave, Jake found Catherine standing alone in the barn, staring at Tempest. The black stallion was calm, his head lowered as Catherine stroked his neck. "You should be sleeping," Jake said quietly. "I can't. Too much to think about." Jake moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Second thoughts?" "1,000 of them." Catherine's voice was raw. "What if I'm wrong? What if this drive fails and I lose everything? Then we pick up the pieces and start over." "We? This isn't your fight, Jake. You've already given me more than anyone has a right to expect. If this goes bad, you don't have to go down with me." Jake turned to face her fully, forcing her to meet his eyes. "When are you going to get it through your head that I'm not here out of obligation? I'm here because I choose to be, because this ranch matters, this fight matters, and you matter. So stop trying to protect me from consequences I've already accepted." "Why?" Catherine's voice broke. "Why do you care so much?" "Because I love you." The words were out before Jake could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Catherine's eyes went wide, her breath catching. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what? Don't love you?" "Too late. You barely know me. I know you're the strongest person I've ever met. I know you'd rather break than bend. I know you carry the weight of this entire ranch on your shoulders and won't let anyone help you even when you're drowning. And I know that underneath all that armor, you're just as scared and lonely as I am." Jake reached out and cupped her face gently. "I love you, Catherine. I didn't plan it. I didn't want it. But it's true, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "This is a terrible idea. Probably the worst I've ever had. We're going to hurt each other. Maybe, but I'd rather risk that than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see the war happening behind her eyes, fear fighting hope, safety fighting possibility. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and kissed him. This kiss was different from the first, softer, deeper, full of everything they'd been holding back for weeks. Jake pulled her closer, and Catherine melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you too," Catherine whispered. "I've been trying not to, but I do." "Good," Jake said, resting his forehead against hers, "because that makes what comes next a lot less complicated." "Nothing about this is less complicated." "No, but at least now we're facing it together." They stood there at the quiet barn with Tempest watching over them, and for the first time since Thomas died, Catherine felt like maybe she wasn't carrying the world alone anymore. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything she'd been running from and everything she'd secretly wanted. "Tomorrow's going to be hell," she said. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "We could die out there. The drive could fail. We could lose everything. We could, or we could succeed, save the ranch, and build something better than what we had before." Catherine pulled back enough to look at him properly. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point?" She laughed, a short, shaky sound that was half sob. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both." Jake kissed her forehead. "Come on. You need sleep, and we've got a long day ahead of us." They walked back to the main house together, hands intertwined, and when Jake left Catherine at her door, the goodnight kiss they shared was sweet and full of promise. Jake returned to the bunkhouse feeling lighter than he had in years, and when he finally fell asleep, it was with a smile on his face. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with clouds gathering on the horizon like a warning. The crew assembled in the yard just after sunrise. 10 men, 500 cattle, 3 weeks of brutal terrain between them and Santa Fe. Catherine stood on the porch in her riding clothes, her hair braided back, her rifle slung across her shoulder. She looked like a warrior preparing for battle. "Listen up," she called out, and every man turned to face her. "I won't lie to you, this drive is going to be hard. We're understaffed, under-equipped, and working against the clock. But if we make it to Santa Fe, everyone here gets paid double what we agreed on. You stick with me, you work hard, and you follow orders, we all come out of this better than we went in. That's my promise. Any questions?" Silence. Catherine nodded, satisfied. "Then let's move out." The drive began slowly, the cattle reluctant to leave familiar pasture. But Marcus and Diego knew their work, and within an hour, the herd was moving steadily south with the crew spread out in a loose perimeter. Jake rode point with Catherine, setting the pace, while Marcus brought up the rear and watched for stragglers. They made good time the first day, covering nearly 15 miles before stopping to make camp. The crew worked efficiently, some tending the herd, others building fires and preparing food. Jake watched Cooper carefully, but the man seemed focused on his work, giving no indication of trouble. That night, after the rest of the crew had bedded down, Jake found Catherine sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling down beside her. "Too much adrenaline." She leaned into him and Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "It will," Jake said honestly. "Drives always have problems. The question is whether we can handle them when they come." "Comforting." "I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to tell you the truth." Catherine smiled slightly at that. "I love that about you. You don't sugarcoat things." "Life's too short for pretty lies." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Around them, the night was alive with sounds, cattle lowing softly, men snoring, the wind moving through grass. It was peaceful in a way that felt fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment. "Jake?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. For everything." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." Catherine turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting firelight. "You saved me. Not just the ranch, me. I was drowning, and I didn't even realize it until you showed me what it felt like to breathe again." Jake kissed her gently. "We saved each other." They stayed by the fire until the embers died completely, then walked back to their respective bedrolls holding hands. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a public acknowledgement of what existed between them. A few of the crew noticed, but nobody said anything. They had bigger things to worry about. The trouble started on the fourth day. They were crossing a shallow river when the cattle spooked, something in the water, maybe a snake, or just the current shifting. The herd panicked, scattering in 3 different directions with terrifying speed. Jake and Marcus worked frantically to turn them back, shouting orders to the crew, but it was chaos. Cattle were running, men were cursing, and in the middle of it all, Jake saw Cooper deliberately drive a section of the herd away from the main group. "Cooper!" Jake shouted. "What are you doing?" Cooper didn't respond. He just kept driving the cattle west, away from the river and toward a rocky outcropping where they'd be impossible to retrieve. Jake spurred his horse after him, fury burning in his chest. He'd known Cooper was trouble, had told Catherine as much, and now they were paying the price. He caught up to Cooper just as the man reached the rocks and grabbed his horse's reins. "I said, what are you doing?" Cooper's expression was cold. "Following orders." "Whose orders?" "Whitmore's. He paid me good money to make sure this drive fails." Cooper pulled a knife from his belt. "Nothing personal, Morrison. Just business." He lunged, and Jake barely dodged the blade. They grappled on horseback, both of them fighting for control of the knife while their horses danced nervously beneath them. Jake managed to get a grip on Cooper's wrist, but the man was stronger than he looked. They crashed to the ground hard, rolling in the dirt, and Jake felt the knife slice across his ribs, shallow but painful. Marcus appeared out of nowhere, his rifle trained on Cooper. "Drop it." Cooper froze, then slowly released the knife. Marcus kicked it away and hauled Cooper to his feet, his expression murderous. "You've got about 5 seconds to explain before I shoot you," Marcus said. "Already told Morrison everything he needs to know," Cooper said, spitting blood. "Whitmore doesn't want this drive to succeed. He paid me to sabotage it. And before you ask, no, I'm not the only one." Jake's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Cooper smiled, revealing bloody teeth. "Whitmore hedged his bets. There's someone else on your crew working for him. I don't know who, but they're out here, and they're going to finish what I started." "You're lying," Marcus growled. "Maybe. Guess you'll find out." Marcus looked at Jake. "What do we do with him?" Jake thought fast. They couldn't afford to spare a man to escort Cooper back to town, but they couldn't trust him with the herd either. And if Cooper was telling the truth about another saboteur, they had bigger problems. "Tie him up, put him on a horse, and take him back to Catherine," Jake said. "Let her decide. In the meantime, we need to round up those scattered cattle before we lose them completely." It took 3 hours to gather the herd back together, and even then they were missing nearly 40 head. Catherine was furious when she heard about Cooper, but she kept her anger tightly controlled. "We leave him tied to a tree with enough water for 3 days," she said coldly. "If he's lucky, someone will find him before he dies of exposure. If not—" She shrugged. "That's the risk you take when you betray people." It was harsh, but nobody argued. They couldn't afford mercy right now. The drive continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone was suspicious, watching each other for signs of betrayal. Jake found himself studying the crew constantly, trying to figure out who else might be working for Whitmore. But everyone seemed genuine, and that made it worse. The enemy could be anyone. 2 days later, disaster struck again. They were camped in a narrow valley when the storm hit. A vicious autumn tempest with lightning that split the sky and rain that turned the ground to mud within minutes. The cattle panicked again, and this time there was no stopping them. They stampeded into the darkness, taking 2 of the pack horses with them. Catherine and Jake rode into the chaos, trying desperately to turn the herd, but it was useless. The cattle were beyond control, driven by pure terror. All they could do was stay out of the way and hope nobody got trampled. When morning came, the damage was catastrophic. They'd lost over 100 head of cattle, 3 horses, and most of their supplies. Worse, Frank had been thrown during the stampede and broken his leg so badly the bone was visible through the skin. Catherine knelt beside him in the mud, her face white with shock. "We need to get him back to the ranch. He needs a doctor." "That's 2 days' ride," Marcus said grimly. "And we can't spare the men." "Then I'll take him myself." "Catherine, I'm not leaving him here to die." Her voice cracked. "We've already lost too much." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "Marcus is right. We can't spare you or the men. But we can splint Frank's leg, make him comfortable, and send someone back for help once we reach Santa Fe." "He might not last that long," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "I know, but it's the only option we have." They splinted Frank's leg as best they could and loaded him onto one of the remaining pack horses. He was feverish, delirious with pain, but conscious enough to understand what was happening. "Leave me," Frank whispered. "Save the herd." "Shut up," Catherine said, her voice fierce. "You're coming with us, and you're going to make it. That's an order." Frank smiled weakly. "Yes, ma'am." They buried the lost supplies, counted the remaining cattle, 370 head, not nearly enough, and pressed on. But morale was shattered, and Jake could feel the crew's faith crumbling. They were exhausted, underfed, and terrified, and they still had over a week to go. That night, Catherine broke down. Jake found her behind one of the wagons, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. He pulled her into his arms and held her while she fell apart, her body shaking with the force of her grief. "I can't do this," she gasped. "I can't. It's too much. I'm going to lose everything, the cattle, the ranch, Frank, all of it." "You're not going to lose everything," Jake said firmly. "We're going to make it to Santa Fe. We're going to sell what's left of the herd, and we're going to save Frank. I promise." "You can't promise that. Watch me." Catherine pulled back enough to look at him, her face streaked with tears and mud. "How are you so calm?" "I'm not calm. I'm terrified. But I learned a long time ago that falling apart doesn't help. So I'm choosing to believe we'll make it. And I'm choosing to fight like hell to make sure we do." Catherine stared at him, and something in her expression shifted. The despair didn't disappear. But it was joined by something else. Determination, maybe, or just stubborn refusal to give up. She wiped her face roughly and took a shaky breath. "Okay," she said. "Okay. We keep going. That's my girl." They rejoined the crew and somehow, impossibly, they kept moving. The days blurred together, endless hours of riding, watching, worrying. Frank's condition worsened, his fever spiking dangerously high. 2 more cattle were lost to predators. And Jake still couldn't shake the feeling that someone on the crew was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On the 12th day, they finally saw Santa Fe on the horizon. The city sprawled across the desert like a promise. Adobe buildings glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Catherine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and Jake felt something loosen in his chest. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. The crew drove the exhausted cattle into the city stockyards, where buyers immediately descended like vultures. Catherine negotiated fiercely, refusing to be lowballed despite their obvious desperation. In the end, she sold the entire herd for enough money to pay off her remaining debts, cover the crew's wages, and have a small cushion left over. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even close to what they would have made at the Dry Creek Valley auction. But it was enough. Frank was rushed to a doctor who confirmed that the leg was badly infected but treatable. Diego and Marcus handled paying the crew while Catherine and Jake collapsed in a hotel room, too exhausted to do anything but sleep. When Catherine woke, it was dark outside, and Jake was sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. "Hey," she said softly. He turned and smiled. "Hey yourself, how do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by 500 cattle." Catherine sat up, wincing. "But we made it." "We made it," Jake agreed. Catherine crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. You're the strongest person I know." "Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the city sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The journey home, rebuilding the herd, dealing with whatever revenge Whitmore had planned. But tonight, they were safe. They were together. And they had hope. "Jake?" Catherine said quietly. "Yeah?" "When we get back to the ranch, I want you to stay. Not as a hired hand, as a partner. Equal stakes, equal say in everything." Jake turned to face her. "Catherine, I mean it. You've earned it. And She took a deep breath. "I want to build something with you. Not just survive, but actually build a life. Together." Jake cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "Yes. To all of it. Yes." Catherine smiled against his lips, and for the first time in years she felt like the future might actually hold something worth fighting for. They had no idea that back in Dry Creek Valley, Edmund Whitmore was planning one final move that would test everything they'd built together. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they were just 2 people who'd fought their way through hell and come out the other side still standing. And that was enough. The journey back to Dry Creek Valley took 8 days instead of 6 because Frank's leg required frequent rest stops and careful monitoring. They traveled slowly, deliberately, with the weight of their victory tempered by exhaustion and the nagging awareness that Edmund Whitmore wouldn't take his defeat quietly. Jake found himself scanning the horizon constantly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on the morning they crossed back into familiar territory. They were less than 10 miles from the ranch when Diego came riding hard from the direction of town. His horse lathered and his face twisted with urgency. "Catherine," he shouted, "we've got a problem." They pulled up, and Jake felt his stomach drop at the expression on Diego's face. Nothing good ever followed words like that. "What happened?" Catherine demanded. "Whitmore filed a claim with the territorial court. He's saying you owe him damages for slander and defamation, something about you spreading false accusations that harmed his business reputation. He's demanding $10,000 or seizure of the ranch." Catherine went pale. "That's insane. Doesn't matter what you did or didn't do. He's got witnesses lined up who'll swear you ruined his reputation, and the judge hearing the case is his cousin." "Of course he is," Jake muttered. Marcus swore violently. When's the hearing?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. If Catherine doesn't show up, Whitmore wins by default." Catherine looked like she'd been punched. They'd just fought their way through hell to save the ranch. and now Whitmore was trying to steal it through legal manipulation. Jake could see the fight draining out of her, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that scared him more than any stampede. "I can't do this anymore," Catherine whispered. "I don't have anything left to fight with." "Yes, you do," Jake said firmly. He dismounted and walked over to her, reaching up to take her hand. "You've got me. You've got Marcus and Diego and everyone who's been fighting alongside you, and you've got the truth. That has to count for something. The truth doesn't matter when the judge is corrupt." "Then we make it matter." Jake looked at Diego. "Who are these witnesses Whitmore's lined up?" "Store owners, mostly. People who depend on the bank for loans. Brennan from the general store, Harris from the livery, a couple others." "So people Whitmore has leverage over," Marcus said. "People who'll lie because they're scared of what happens if they don't." Exactly. Jake's mind was racing, putting together a plan that was probably reckless, but might be their only shot. "We need to get to those witnesses before the hearing, find out what Whitmore's holding over them, and offer them a better deal." "What kind of deal?" Catherine asked. "Protection. A promise that if they tell the truth, we'll make sure Whitmore can't retaliate. It's a gamble, but it might work." "Or it might get them hurt," Catherine said quietly. "I can't ask people to risk their livelihoods for me." "You're not asking. I am." Jake squeezed her hand. "Let me try. Please. If it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out. But we have to try." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her wrestling with hope and fear and the exhaustion of fighting for so long. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but we do this carefully. I won't put innocent people in danger." They made camp 3 miles outside town and sent Diego ahead to scout the situation. When he returned 2 hours later, his news was mixed. Brennan, the general store owner, was the key witness, the one Whitmore was relying on to paint Catherine as a vindictive liar who'd cost him business. But according to Diego's sources, Brennan wasn't happy about it. He was testifying because Whitmore threatened to call in his store's debts early, which would bankrupt him. "So we give him a way out," Jake said. "Catherine, how much does Brennan owe the bank?" "I don't know exactly, maybe $400-500. "And we've got how much left from the cattle sale?" Catherine pulled out the small lockbox where she'd been keeping their remaining funds. $840 after paying the crew and covering supplies. "Then we pay off Brennan's debt ourselves." "Jake, it's an investment," Jake interrupted. "We buy his freedom, he tells the truth, and Whitmore's case falls apart. It's worth every penny." Marcus was nodding slowly. "It could work, but we'd need to move fast. Whitmore's probably got men watching Brennan to make sure he doesn't change his mind." "Then we go tonight," Jake said. "Quiet. Just me and Catherine. The rest of you stay here and keep Frank comfortable." As darkness fell, Jake and Catherine rode into Dry Creek Valley under cover of night. The town was quiet, most of its residents already asleep. They tied their horses behind the general store and approached through the back alley, moving like ghosts. Jake knocked softly on the rear door. After a long moment, it cracked open, and Brennan's suspicious face appeared in the gap. "What do you want?" he hissed. "To help you," Catherine said quietly. "Can we come in?" Brennan hesitated, then opened the door wider. Inside, the store was dark, except for a single lamp burning on the counter. Brennan looked terrible, his face drawn, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking as he locked the door behind them. "If Whitmore finds out I talked to you, I'm finished," he said. "Then we make sure he doesn't find out," Jake replied. "How much do you owe the bank?" $460. "Why?" Catherine pulled out the lockbox and began counting bills. "Because we're going to pay it off. Tonight. All of it." Brennan stared at the growing pile of money on his counter like it was a snake that might bite him. "I don't understand." "It's simple," Jake said. "We pay your debt, Whitmore loses his leverage, and tomorrow you tell the truth in court. You don't owe us anything except honesty." "Whitmore will destroy me." "Not if we destroy him first." Catherine's voice was steel. "I'm done playing defense, Mr. Brennan. I'm done letting that man terrorize this town. But I need people to stand with me. I need you to stand with me." Brennan looked at her, then at the money, then back at her. Jake could see the war happening behind his eyes. Fear versus principle. Safety versus justice. It was the kind of choice that defined a person's character, and Jake found himself holding his breath while they waited for the answer. "Tell me exactly what you need me to say," Brennan said finally. Relief flooded through Jake so powerfully it made him dizzy. They spent the next hour going over testimony, making sure Brennan understood what questions to expect and how to answer truthfully without embellishing. By the time they left, Brennan looked terrified but determined, and Jake allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The next morning, Jake and Catherine walked into the Dry Creek Valley Courthouse with Marcus and Diego flanking them like bodyguards. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like half the town had shown up to watch the spectacle. Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with a smug lawyer, radiating confidence. When he saw Catherine, his smile widened. The judge, a gray-haired man named Hutchins, who had Whitmore's eyes and probably his morals, banged his gavel and called the court to order. Whitmore's lawyer stood and began his opening statement, painting Catherine as a bitter widow who'd spread malicious lies about an honest businessman out of spite and jealousy. It was a masterful performance, full of righteous indignation and carefully chosen words designed to make Catherine look unstable. When it was Catherine's turn to respond, she stood with quiet dignity. "Your Honor, I've never lied about Edmund Whitmore. I've told people exactly what he is. A man who uses intimidation and corruption to steal from those weaker than himself. If the truth damages his reputation, that's his problem, not mine." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hutchins banged his gavel. "You'll have a chance to present evidence, Miss Sterling. For now, sit down." Whitmore's lawyer called his first witness, a nervous banker who testified that Catherine had come to the bank and loudly accused Whitmore of fraud in front of other customers. It was a lie, but the banker delivered it convincingly. Two more witnesses followed with similar stories, each one adding to the narrative that Catherine was unstable and vindictive. Then Brennan was called to the stand. Jake watched Whitmore's face carefully as Brennan was sworn in. The banker looked pleased, confident that his key witness would seal the deal. Whitmore's lawyer approached with a predatory smile. "Mr. Brennan, you own the general store here in Dry Creek Valley, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you've had business dealings with Miss Sterling?" "Yes, sir. She's a customer." "And has she ever made accusations about Mr. Whitmore in your presence?" Brennan was quiet for a moment. In the gallery, Whitmore leaned forward slightly, waiting for the killing blow. "No, sir," Brennan said clearly. "She is not." The courtroom erupted. Whitmore's face went from pleased to furious in less than a second. His lawyer stammered, trying to recover. "Mr. Brennan, are you certain you told me just yesterday?" "I told you what you wanted to hear because you threatened to ruin me if I didn't," Brennan interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "But Miss Sterling paid off my debts last night, which means I don't owe you or the bank anything anymore, so I'm going to tell the truth. Catherine Sterling never slandered Edmund Whitmore. She told people facts. Facts about how he manipulates interest rates, intimidates borrowers, and uses criminal tactics to steal property. If you want to talk about damaged reputations, maybe we should discuss why half the people in this courtroom are too scared to speak against him." Judge Hutchins was banging his gavel frantically, trying to restore order, but it was too late. Brennan had opened the floodgates, and other people in the gallery were starting to murmur their own stories about Whitmore's corruption. The judge called a recess, and during the break, two other witnesses for the plaintiff suddenly developed convenient amnesia about what Catherine had supposedly said. When court resumed, Whitmore's lawyer tried to salvage the case by attacking Brennan's credibility, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and even Judge Hutchins couldn't ignore it without making his bias obvious. After less than an hour of deliberation, the judge dismissed Whitmore's claim with prejudice. Catherine stood as the verdict was read, and Jake saw tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but of relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. They walked out of the courthouse into bright morning sunshine, and the small crowd that had gathered outside broke into spontaneous applause. "You did it," Jake said, wrapping his arms around her. "We did it," Catherine corrected, her voice muffled against his chest. "All of us." Whitmore emerged from the courthouse moments later, his face purple with rage. He locked eyes with Catherine across the courtyard, and Jake tensed, ready for violence. But Whitmore just sneered. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Catherine replied calmly. "You've lost, Edmund. Your reputation is destroyed, your schemes are exposed, and if you come near me or my ranch again, I'll make sure everyone from here to the territorial capital knows exactly what kind of man you are. Now get out of my sight." Whitmore looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Catherine's expression, The absolute certainty that she'd won made him think better of it. He turned and stalked away, and Jake felt the last of the tension drain from his body. They celebrated that night at the ranch with what was left of the crew. Frank was recovering slowly, his legs splinted and elevated, but he was conscious enough to join the festivities from his cot. Diego produced a bottle of whiskey that he'd been saving for a special occasion, and Marcus actually smiled, a rare sight that made everyone do a double take. "To Catherine Sterling," Diego said, raising his glass. "The toughest woman in the territory." "To survival," Marcus added. "To new beginnings," Jake said, his eyes locked on Catherine's. They drank, and for a few hours the weight of the past months lifted. They were just people who'd fought through hell together and come out the other side still standing. The ranch was saved, the debts were paid, Whitmore was defeated. It felt like a miracle, even though Jake knew it was just the result of hard work, stubbornness, and more luck than they probably deserved. Later, after the others had drifted off to sleep, Jake and Catherine sat on the porch steps watching the stars. Tempest stood in his corral nearby, a dark silhouette against the night sky. "I keep waiting to wake up and find out this was all a dream," Catherine said softly. "It's real," Jake assured her. "We're really here. We really won." "It doesn't feel real." "Give it time." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "What happens now? Now we rebuild. We buy new cattle, repair what needs repairing, build this ranch into something sustainable. And we do it together. As partners." "As partners," Jake confirmed. "Equal stakes, equal say, just like you promised." Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" "What?" "I spent 2 years convinced I had to do everything alone. I thought accepting help meant weakness, that independence meant isolation. And I was drowning, Jake. I was drowning and didn't even realize it until you showed me what it felt like to have someone actually stand beside me instead of trying to control me or save me." "You didn't need saving," Jake said. "You just needed someone who saw you for who you really are and loved you anyway." "Is that what this is? Love?" Jake turned to look at her properly. "Yeah, that's what this is, at least for me." Catherine smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger, lighter, like the weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. "For me, too. I love you, Jake Morrison. I don't know how it happened so fast, but I do." "Nothing about us has been slow," Jake said with a slight laugh. "We jumped in the deep end and figured out how to swim on the way down. Are you complaining? Not even a little bit." They kissed under the stars, and it felt different from all the kisses that had come before, less desperate, less urgent, but deeper somehow. It felt like a promise, like the beginning of something they'd both been searching for without knowing what it was called. Over the next 3 months, the Sterling Ranch transformed. Jake and Catherine worked side by side, rebuilding the herd, repairing structures, implementing new breeding programs that focused on quality over quantity. Marcus grudgingly admitted that Jake's ideas were sound, and the two men developed a working relationship built on mutual respect, if not exactly friendship. Diego became the foreman, managing the day-to-day operations with efficiency that surprised everyone. And Frank recovered slowly but surely, eventually regaining enough mobility to work from a chair doing bookkeeping and inventory management. Word of Catherine's victory over Whitmore spread through the territory, and other ranchers who'd been intimidated by the banker started fighting back. Within 6 months, Whitmore's empire had crumbled. The bank was investigated by territorial authorities, Whitmore was arrested for fraud and extortion, and his cousin Judge Hutchins was removed from the bench. It wasn't perfect justice. Whitmore's lawyers would probably get him a light sentence, and some of the people he'd hurt would never recover what they'd lost. But it was something. It was change. On a cold November morning, Jake found Catherine in the barn working with a new colt, a spirited bay filly with Tempest's eyes and intelligence. Catherine was patient with the young horse, moving slowly and speaking softly, earning trust instead of demanding obedience. Jake leaned against the fence and watched, feeling a contentment he'd never thought possible. "You're staring," Catherine said without looking up. "Can't help it. You're beautiful when you're working. I'm covered in horsehair and manure. Still beautiful." Catherine laughed and walked over to him, brushing hay off her shirt. "You're biased." "Completely." Jake pulled her close. "I've been thinking about something." "That's dangerous." I'm serious. I've been thinking about the future, about what we're building here. Catherine's expression grew cautious. And? And I think we should make it official. The partnership, I mean. Draw up legal papers that protect both of us, make sure everything's documented properly. I don't want there to be any question about where we stand. That's very practical of you. I'm a practical man. Jake took a breath, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since the day he first rode Tempest. But I'm also thinking about making something else official. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Jake, hear me out. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life building something with you. Not just this ranch, but a real life. A family, maybe, if you want that. A future where we're not just surviving, but actually living. And I know that sounds like romantic nonsense, but Catherine kissed him, effectively cutting off the nervous rambling. When she pulled back, she was smiling. Yes, she said simply. Yes? Yes, to all of it. The legal partnership, the marriage, the family, the future. Yes. Jake felt something in his chest expand so suddenly it was almost painful. Not the kind of pain that hurt, but the kind that came from a space that had been empty for so long suddenly being filled. He'd spent 5 years as a ghost, drifting through life without purpose or connection. And now he had both. He had Catherine, he had this ranch. He had a reason to wake up every morning and fight for something better. When? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Whenever you want. Tomorrow, next week, next year. I don't care about the timing, I just care that it's with you. They decided on a simple ceremony in early December, before the winter storms made travel impossible. They invited the crew, a few friends from town, and Sheriff Wade Parker, who agreed to officiate. There was no fancy dress, no elaborate celebration, just honest people gathering to witness two damaged souls choosing to build something whole together. The ceremony took place on the ranch at sunset, with Tempest standing nearby like a silent guardian. Catherine wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and Jake wore his best shirt with his hair actually combed for once. When Wade asked if they had vows prepared, they looked at each other and smiled. I promise to stand beside you, Catherine said. Not in front, not behind. Beside. I promise to trust you with my fears and my hopes, and I promise to keep fighting for us, for this ranch, for the life we're building every single day. I promise to see you, Jake said. Really see you. Not the armor you wear or the walls you build, but the person underneath. I promise to be honest even when it's hard. And I promise to stay, Catherine. No matter what comes, I'm staying. They exchanged plain gold bands, practical, sturdy, built to last. And when Wade pronounced them married, the small crowd erupted in cheers. Marcus clapped Jake on the back hard enough to bruise, Diego whistled loudly, and Frank wiped away tears he'd probably deny later. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and laughter that rang out across the empty land. At one point, Catherine pulled Jake aside, away from the crowd, and they stood together in the quiet darkness watching the stars. You know what I realized? Catherine said. What? I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, that independence was the same thing as isolation. But you taught me that real strength is knowing when to ask for help. Real independence is choosing who you let into your life, not shutting everyone out because you're scared of getting hurt. You taught me some things too, Jake said. You taught me that running from pain doesn't make it go away, that caring about something is always worth the risk, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay in one place and build something instead of always chasing the horizon. We're pretty wise for two people who've spent most of the year making things up as we go along, Catherine said with a laugh. Who says we're going to stop? Fair point. They stood there together, and Jake thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the day he'd ridden into Dry Creek Valley with nothing but a worn-out horse and empty pockets. How Catherine had been drowning in debt and loneliness. How Tempest had been waiting for someone worthy enough to understand him instead of trying to break him. He thought about all the ways things could have gone wrong. The stampede, the sabotage, the legal battles, and how they'd survived it all through stubbornness and trust and the sheer refusal to give up. Life wasn't a fairy tale. There was no guarantee they'd live happily ever after. There would be hard winters and failed harvests, arguments and mistakes, moments when they'd wonder if they'd made the right choices. But they'd face all of it together, and that made all the difference. Over the following years, the Sterling Ranch became known throughout the territory as one of the finest horse breeding operations west of the Rio Grande. Catherine's methods, built on patience and partnership rather than dominance, produced animals that were not just trained but genuinely connected to their riders. People traveled from hundreds of miles away to buy Sterling horses, and the waiting list grew longer every season. But more than the commercial success, the ranch became something else. A refuge for lost souls looking for second chances. Drifters who'd given up on themselves found purpose there. Cowboys running from their pasts discovered futures worth staying for. Women escaping bad situations found safety and opportunity. Catherine and Jake never turned away anyone who was willing to work hard and treat others with respect, and the crew that formed around them became something closer to family than employees. Tempest sired dozens of foals over the years, each one carrying some measure of his intelligence and spirit. But he remained Catherine's horse first and always, the animal that had started it all, by refusing to accept anything less than genuine connection. Even in old age, Tempest commanded respect, and young horses seemed to instinctively understand that he was something special. Jake never forgot what it felt like to be a ghost drifting through life without purpose. That memory kept him grounded, kept him grateful, kept him fighting for every person who showed up at the ranch looking for the same thing he'd once needed, a place to belong. And Catherine never forgot what it felt like to drown alone, which meant she never took for granted the partnership they'd built or the life they'd created together. They had 3 children over the years, 2 daughters and a son, all of them inheriting their parents' stubbornness and their unwillingness to accept easy answers. Catherine taught them how to read horses, how to earn trust instead of demanding obedience, how to be strong without being cruel. Jake taught them how to fix what was broken, how to keep going when things got hard, how to stay when running would be easier. On warm summer evenings, the family would sit on the porch and watch Tempest in his pasture, and Jake would tell his children the story of how he'd come to the ranch with nothing, how their mother had challenged him to be better than he thought possible, how one untamed horse had taught him that strength and gentleness weren't opposites, but partners. And the moral of the story is, his oldest daughter asked one night. Jake looked at Catherine, who smiled and answered for both of them. The moral is that real strength doesn't come from dominating others or protecting yourself from pain. It comes from having the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to let people in even when you're scared. It comes from standing beside someone instead of trying to stand alone. And it comes from understanding that sometimes the wildest thing needs isn't to be tamed. It just needs to be understood. The children nodded, absorbing the lesson in the way children do. And Jake knew they'd probably have to learn it themselves the hard way like everyone else. But at least they'd have the example of their parents' lives, proof that broken people could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that hope wasn't just wishful thinking, but a choice you made every single day. Years later, when Jake was old and gray, he would sometimes stand at Tempest's grave. The black stallion had lived a long, proud life before passing peacefully in his sleep. And remember that first morning when he'd approached the corral as a stranger with nothing to offer except patience and respect. He'd remember the way Tempest had chosen to trust him, the way Catherine had chosen to let him stay, the way his entire life had changed because he'd finally stopped running and started building. And he'd remember the lesson that had taken him 32 years and countless mistakes to learn. That the things worth having were never the things you could force or control. They were the things that chose you back when you approached them with honesty, patience, and the willingness to be changed by the connection. The Sterling Ranch outlived both Jake and Catherine, passed down through their children and grandchildren, a testament to what 2 damaged people could build when they stopped trying to survive alone and started living together. The story of Tempest, the horse that couldn't be broken, and the man who understood that breaking wasn't the point, became legend in the territory, told and retold until fact and fiction blurred together. But the heart of the story remained true. That somewhere in the wild frontier, a widow and a drifter had found each other against impossible odds. That they'd fought through theft and sabotage and their own fears to build something that lasted. That they'd proven love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose damage fit with yours in a way that made both of you whole. And that sometimes the greatest act of courage wasn't conquering what stood in your way. It was having the strength to admit you couldn't do it alone, and the wisdom to accept help when it was offered. In the end, the Sterling Ranch became more than just a successful business or a refuge for lost souls. It became proof that the hard-won things, the things built through struggle and sacrifice, and the daily choice to keep trying were the things that mattered most. That trust was earned through actions, not words. That partnership meant standing beside someone through the storms, not just enjoying the sunny days. And that the wildest hearts didn't need to be tamed. They just needed to be understood. Jake Morrison had ridden into Dry Creek Valley searching for something he couldn't name. He'd found a woman as fierce and broken as he was, a horse that refused to accept anything less than genuine connection and a purpose worth fighting for. Together, they'd built a life that defied all the odds stacked against them. And if that wasn't a happy ending, it was something better, a real one, earned through blood and tears and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other or themselves. The Sterling Ranch stood for generations as a reminder that in the brutal, unforgiving frontier, the strongest thing you could be wasn't invulnerable. It was honest. It was willing to change. It was brave enough to trust. And that was a lesson worth remembering long after the last of the Sterling horses had passed into legend and the people who'd lived these events had returned to dust. Because the truth they'd lived wasn't just their story. It was everyone's story, the universal struggle to find connection in a world that tried to teach us that independence meant isolation, that strength meant never needing anyone, that safety required walls high enough to keep everyone out. Jake and Catherine had learned differently. They'd learned that the walls only kept you trapped, that real strength required vulnerability, that the greatest risk was also the greatest reward. And in learning those lessons, they'd created something that outlasted them both. Not just a ranch or a legacy, but a truth that echoed through time. That we're all just wild hearts looking for someone brave enough to understand us instead of trying to tame us. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find them.